Everyone wants a love that lasts. But in a world of fragile relationships, alarming divorce rates, and endless confusion about marriage, is lifelong, faithful love even possible? The Church says yes, but not by our strength alone. In this episode, we explore how Christ transforms marriage from a human promise into a sacrament filled with divine power. Shalom and welcome back to Living in the Kingdom, an introduction to the Catholic Church and part 2 of Catholics for Israel's online Bible course, where we unpack God's plan of loving kindness for us. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve. In our last episode, we stepped back to look at human love in God's revelation, created, fallen, and redeemed. How God is love, how we are created in His image as male and female, how sin distorts our relationships, and how Christ restores and elevates human love. Today, in the second part of our 3-episode series on marriage and the family, we move to the heart of that restoration, the sacrament of matrimony. Marriage is one of the most universal human experiences, and one of the most challenging. Couples enter marriage with hope, joy, and the desire to give themselves completely. Yet, many also carry wounds, fears, or confusion about what marriage really is. Is it just a contract, a romantic partnership, a legal arrangement, or something deeper? The Church teaches that Christian marriage is not merely a human institution. It is a sacrament, a visible sign through which Christ Himself acts. In matrimony, the spouses freely exchange consent, bind themselves in an unbreakable covenant, and receive a grace that strengthens their unity, deepens their love, and equips them to welcome and educate children. Their love becomes a real participation in Christ's own free, total, faithful, and fruitful love for His bride, the Church. In this episode, we explore what makes marriage a sacrament, why the spouses themselves are the ministers, what the Church means by indissolubility and fidelity, and how the grace of matrimony helps couples carry their crosses, forgive one another, and grow in holiness together. Before we begin, if you like this content, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Building a civilization of love. God's plan for marriage and the family. Part 2. The Sacrament of Matrimony. The Code of Canon Law and the Catechism of the Catholic Church define marriage as follows. The covenant of marriage by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. This is our mission statement for today that we are going to unpack over the course of this video. So marriage, a man and a woman establish this partnership for the whole of life, and towards what is it ordained? Towards the good of the spouses, their own good of husband and wife, and the procreation and education of children, bringing forth new life into the world. And Christ, by His death and resurrection, has raised natural marriage to the level of a sacrament, a sign that points to the union between Christ and the Church. What is the sacrament of matrimony? John Paul II, in his apostolic exhortation on the Christian family, says this about marriage. The sacramentality of marriage binds the spouses to one another in an indissoluble manner. The spouses belonging to each other is a real representation of the relationship of Christ with the Church. Recall what a sacrament is. Every sacrament is a sacred sign. It's something that's physical, that points to an invisible spiritual reality, namely the bond between God and His people, or between Christ and the Church. And so marriage in a particular way, in the love between husband and wife that brings forth new life, points to this union between Christ and the church, and at the same time reflects his love for the church. So it's a great responsibility for Christian spouses to live out this sign of Christ's love for the church. Because of this, conjugal love or marital love involves a totality including all the elements of the person. It aims at a deeply personal unity, forming one heart and soul between husband and wife and their children. It demands indissolubility and faithfulness in definitive mutual giving, and is open to fertility. With this, we connect back to what we said last time about the nature of marriage, that marriage is called to be free, total, faithful, and fruitful. And we see this in these 4 characteristics or 4 essential traits of Christian marriage: the totality, the personal unity, the indissolubility and faithfulness, and this open to fertility, to new life. Let's briefly look at the celebration of a Catholic marriage. Between 2 Catholics, the Sacrament of Matrimony normally takes place during Mass, and this establishes and highlights the connection of matrimony with the Paschal mystery. As I just mentioned, the greatest example of God's nuptial or marital love for his people is Christ's own death at the cross, by which he espoused the church to himself. And so it's by no coincidence that normally a Catholic wedding takes place within the context of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, which recalls and makes present Christ's Paschal mystery. So there is this intrinsic connection between the marriage between husband and wife and the Paschal mystery at Mass. Because marriage is such a great mystery, it requires preparation. So the Church highly recommends a thorough preparation to Catholic couples who plan to get married, and this would include going to confession, receiving the sacrament of reconciliation before getting married, to be sure to start with a blank slate to clear out the sins in our lives so that we are more prepared to enter into this covenant of love with our spouse. In the celebration of Catholic marriage, the spouses confer upon each other the sacrament of matrimony by expressing their consent before the church. What do we see here? Who actually confers the sacrament on the spouses? It is themselves. Husband and wife confer the sacrament upon themselves, and not the priest or deacon. So at a Catholic wedding, the priest or deacon are acting as witnesses and not technically as the ministers of the sacrament. The ministers of the sacrament are husband and wife as they express their consent before the entire church. By these words that are well known, I, the husband, take you, my wife, for my faithful wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Right there in the exchange of consent and the exchange of vows, you can see this expressed faithfulness and totality and commitment for one's entire life until death do us part. During the sacrament of marriage, in the epiclesis, the calling of the Holy Spirit, the spouses themselves receive the Holy Spirit as the communion of love of Christ and the Church, as the seal of their covenant, and as the source of their love and the strength to renew their fidelity throughout their entire lives. What technically makes marriage? It is the matrimonial consent between the 2 spouses. To enter marriage, a man and a woman must freely express their consent. And by free, what do we mean by that? They have to be not under any kind of constraint, coercion, or fear, and they must not be impeded by any natural or ecclesiastical law. So this is basically what makes marriage. It is the consent between husband and wife, and there must not be any kind of obstacle to this consent between the spouses. The exchange of consent between the spouses makes the marriage. If consent is lacking, there is no marriage. So technically, there can be no such thing as a forced marriage, because if a marriage is forced, it is not a marriage at all. It must be freely entered into by the 2 spouses. And the consent is fulfilled in the marital act. And so when husband and wife have sexual relations together, this is what we call the consummation of the marriage, which ratifies and fulfills this consent that was expressed in the vows of the spouses. This is why marriage, or the sacrament of matrimony, is an ecclesial reality. It is not just a personal vow that husband and wife make before one another and maybe before their family and friends, but it is truly an ecclesial reality. Since marriage establishes the couple in a public state of life in the church, it is a public, ecclesial, and liturgical act. This is why the presence of the church at every Catholic marriage is absolutely essential. And we might also say that marriage is, of course, a social act. It is never purely personal between the spouses. So this is why the role of the church is absolutely essential for marriage to be truly a sacrament. And this is why, as I already mentioned, preparation for marriage is essential. It is essential for Catholic couples to know what they're getting into before they enter this lifelong commitment, which reflects the love between Christ and the church. Now, we know that in a fallen world, marriages tragically don't always work out, and we know what our society looks like. There are many divorces. The rate of divorce has been high now for several generations, but famously, we know that Catholics don't believe in divorce, and they have this type of version of divorce which they call annulment. Well, this is a bit of a myth. An annulment is not a Catholic divorce. So what exactly is an annulment? Well, the fact is that the church can declare the nullity of a marriage, namely that the marriage never existed in the first place. So an annulment is not a fancy Catholic term for divorce. A divorce is basically a dissolution of the marriage after the couple basically decide that it's not working out. Now, the Catholic Church does not recognize this type of dynamic because when the Catholic couples enter a marriage, they truly make a vow to each other for life until death do them part. So annulment is not a Catholic divorce. And the theology behind this idea of annulments is that a marriage is either valid or not at the moment of the exchange of vows. The later situation of the marriage does not affect its validity. So the point is that at the very moment of marriage, is this marriage valid or not? Were there any impediments or any serious issues that placed an obstacle in preventing this marriage from being valid? This is what we know as an impediment. So the later situation of the marriage does not affect its validity. So what does all this mean? What are some examples of impediments to marriage or conditions when the couple got married that basically prevented the marriage from being valid? Well, this would include things like the minimal age. The man must be at least 16 years old and the woman at least 14 years old. Obviously, this is still way too young in our day and age, but this is what we call the canonical limit. Any age that is lesser than that, the marriage is automatically invalid. Perpetual impotence, or the inability to have sexual relations, this is not the same as sterility, the inability to have children. So this confirms what we said last time, that the church is absolutely not against sex. On the contrary, if one of the spouses is unable to have sexual relations, well, this invalidates the marriage. A previous marriage, if one of the spouses is still bound to a previous spouse, then automatically this marriage is invalid. Marriage between a Catholic and a non-baptized person. This is what we know as disparity of cult, and dispensations can be granted. But if there is no dispensation, a Catholic who marries someone who is not baptized, this is automatically an invalid marriage. Sacred orders or a vow of chastity. For example, if a priest leaves the priesthood without a formal permission from the Vatican, or a religious who has a vow of chastity and then attempt to enter into a marriage, this marriage is automatically invalid. Abduction, kidnapping would violate the freedom and consent that is necessary for a valid marriage, and this would automatically invalidate it. Murder of current spouse automatically invalidates the attempted marriage. Direct line of consanguinity, so this is obvious in modern culture. Any kind of close relationship between father and daughter, for example, between brother and sister, and even first cousins, up to a certain distance of consanguinity, this would automatically invalidate a marriage. Consent is lacking. As we said, consent makes marriage, and so if there is no consent, there is no marriage. Also, significantly, if either or both of the parties by a positive act of the will excludes marriage itself or some essential element of it, this automatically invalidates the marriage. So for example, if one of the two partners decides from the get-go, I'm never going to have children, and intends to contracept throughout the entire marriage, this invalidates the marriage from the very beginning. So openness to life and openness to children is an essential component of marriage. And so if by a positive act of the will, one of the spouses decides, well, to me, this is not really a marriage, I'm doing this to please my spouse or my in-laws, well, this actually invalidates the marriage. And same-sex unions, obviously, from a biblical, Christian, and Catholic perspective, are not marriages at all because they require the complementarity between men and women as ordained by God. Let's focus on the question of mixed marriages. We live in a pluralistic society where people fall in love across denominational and even religious boundaries. So what does the church have to say about Catholics marrying non-Catholics? Here we have basically two categories. What is a mixed marriage? It is a marriage between a Catholic and a baptized non-Catholic. So this would be a Catholic who marries a non-Catholic Christian who has been baptized. Now, this requires the church's permission. They are somewhat common. They are not rare for a Catholic to marry a Protestant or an Orthodox Christian, for example. And so it is possible, but it requires the church's permission. Now, on the other level, we have what we call a disparity of cult. This would be a marriage between a Catholic person and someone who is not a Christian at all. This is a much larger gap between the faith of the two. And this is actually an impediment to marriage, which would automatically invalidate the marriage. Now, a dispensation is possible in this case. For example, it is possible for a Catholic to marry a Jew or a Muslim or even an atheist. This is possible, but it is an impediment, and a dispensation from this impediment is required. For sure, it is not recommended because there is such substantial obstacles and differences in the worldview between a believing Catholic and someone who is not, that this can really cause problems, especially when children come along and it's time to educate them in a Catholic or Christian worldview. So mixed marriages are possible but not recommended. They can truly be a source of disunity, of tension between the spouses, and they may lead to religious indifference or apathy. The children see mom and dad who have completely different beliefs. What are they going to believe? It's all the same in the end. And so it can lead to this religious indifferentism within the family. Now, the permission or dispensation for a mixed marriage or disparity of cult presupposes that both parties know and do not exclude the essential ends and properties of marriage. In other words, fidelity, totality, openness to new life, and so on. Furthermore, the Catholic party confirms the obligations made known to the non-Catholic party of preserving his or her own faith and ensuring the baptism and education of the children in the Catholic Church. So this is a serious requirement. If a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, the Church will grant a permission or dispensation on the condition that the children are raised in the Catholic faith. So you might say this is a bit asymmetrical and is placing demands on the non-Catholic party that are kind of a big deal, but this is essentially what the non-Catholic party would be willing to enter into by marrying a Catholic. Marriages with disparity of cult may lead to the conversion of the other spouse. Every Catholic should pray for the conversion of everyone to the true faith, for them to come to faith in the Messiah of Israel. And so marriages within this disparity of cult may lead to the conversion of the other, but it's not something that Catholic spouses should count on. It does not always happen. And as we said, it can lead to some serious tensions and divisions within a marriage. And this is why, especially disparity of cult, marriages between Catholics and non-baptized believers are certainly not recommended because they carry some fairly high risks. Let's talk about the marriage bond. In a valid marriage, God seals a perpetual and exclusive bond between the spouses. This goes back to God's original purpose for marriage, which he established at creation. So the covenant between the spouses is integrated into God's covenant with man. The covenant between husband and wife becomes a part of God's covenant with all of humanity. And this is why a marriage that is concluded and consummated by a sexual union between baptized persons can never be dissolved. This is the foundation for the indissolubility of marriage. And the church actually does not have any power to contravene this disposition of divine wisdom because it was established by God at creation, as we can read in Genesis chapter 2, and restored to its original purpose by Jesus himself in the Gospels, as we will see shortly. What does matrimony do? It conveys grace to the spouses. Remember what grace is? It is the very life of love that God imparts to believers. The grace of matrimony is to perfect the couple's love and to strengthen their indissoluble unity. By this grace, they help one another to attain holiness and in welcoming and educating their children. So God provides grace. He provides his help to couples who enter into the sacrament of matrimony. It is something that is supernatural that helps them to bear their burdens throughout a whole life together. Christ is the source of this grace. He encounters Christian spouses through the sacrament and gives them the strength to take up their crosses and to follow him, to rise again after they have fallen, to forgive one another, to bear one another's burdens, to be subject to one another, and to love one another with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love in imitation of Christ. In the joys of their love and family life, Jesus gives them here on earth a foretaste of the wedding feast of the Lamb. Once again, this is the idea of sacramentality. Marriage participates in the marriage between Christ and his bride, the church. This is why the love of husband and wife is obviously an integral part of Christian marriage. Physical intimacy between the spouses becomes a sign and pledge of spiritual communion. As we said last time, we are a union of body and soul, of matter and spirit, and so the physical union between husband and wife reflects this spiritual union that they commit to each other. Sexuality is good, obviously, between husband and wife, yet it is only truly human as part of the lifelong love between a man and a woman within the covenant of marriage, as we said in our last lesson. The union of the spouses achieves the inseparable twofold end of marriage and sexuality: the good of the spouses, the unitive aspect, and the transmission of life, or the procreative aspect. And this requires fidelity and fecundity. These two aspects, the unitive and the procreative, cannot be artificially separated without damaging the deepest truth of the conjugal act, or the sexual union between husband and wife. All this we studied last time in our study of God's plan for love and sexuality in divine revelation. Let's now look at the goods and requirements of conjugal love. There are essentially three that we're going to examine. 1, the unity and indissolubility of marriage. 2, the fidelity of conjugal love. And 3, the openness to fertility. The first one, the unity and indissolubility of marriage. This goes back to Jesus' words, especially in Matthew chapter 19, where he says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate." The love of the spouses requires the unity and indissolubility of the spouses' community of persons, which embraces their entire life. So as Jesus says, they are no longer two but one flesh. This is setting the bar quite high for Christian marriage. Husband and wife become one flesh and they can no longer be separated. This is not an invention of the church. It goes back to divine revelation, to the teachings of Jesus that go back to God's original purpose for marriage in Genesis chapter 2. Therefore, marriage embraces the entire life of the spouses. They are called to grow continually in their communion through day-to-day fidelity to their marriage promise of total mutual self-giving. It's hard, but Christ gives Catholic couples the grace to live that out. They are no longer two but one flesh. Husband and wife give themselves definitively and totally to one another. This is the heart of the unity and indissolubility of marriage. This leads naturally into the fidelity of conjugal love. And here we see again the words of Jesus that once again set the bar quite high and reveals how difficult marriage is. Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." So Jesus is quite severe here as he teaches about marriage, saying that truly marriage is indissoluble, and even if there is some kind of separation between the spouses, they still remain married to one another. Conjugal love requires the inviolable fidelity of the spouses. Once again, this fidelity reflects God's fidelity for his people, Christ's fidelity for the church. The intimate union of marriage as a mutual giving of two persons and the good of the children require an unbreakable union between them. Spouses are called to represent the fidelity of God to his covenant and that of Christ to his church. For this reason, between the baptized, a ratified and consummated marriage cannot be dissolved by any human power or for any reason other than death. The proverbial Catholic marriage that is unbreakable, that is indissoluble, this is the foundation right there in Jesus' teachings. Once again, I mentioned annulments, and it is possible, indeed, it is not rare for Catholic marriages to be invalid from the start because of some serious impediment. But if the marriage is valid, then it is truly a commitment until death do us part. As we understand the nature of marriage and the importance of totality, of fidelity, of indissolubility, we can better understand the sins against marriage and especially adultery and divorce. These are things that we already studied in our review of the 10 Commandments several lessons ago. So we can now better understand why adultery, that is marital infidelity, is a grave sin against the covenant of marriage. It's a great offense against the other spouse and against the children who need their parents' stable union. So obviously an extremely serious sin, adultery. It's right there in the Decalogue, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," a violation of this covenant of love between the spouses. Also, divorce separates what God has joined together. It is a grave offense against the natural law and against God's will that marriage be indissoluble. So we have to say, my friends, divorce is a very serious sin. Now, obviously, some people do not seek divorce, but it is essentially inflicted upon them, either through infidelity of the spouse or one of the spouses leaves the other. And so we can certainly be a victim of divorce if we want no part in it, but the one who initiates divorce and actively breaks this covenant between the spouses is guilty of a very serious sin. Now, the church is realistic. Physical separation is sometimes unavoidable, especially if there is verbal or physical violence within the family, but the spouses continue to be husband and wife before God. You're not free to contract a new union. So really the big problem in divorce, even more than the actual separation between the spouses, is the case where one or both of the spouses get remarried to someone else, because technically and canonically they are still married to their original spouse. The remarriage of divorced persons contradicts God's law. The divorced person who remarries remains in a situation of public and permanent adultery. So this is a serious matter. Now, it doesn't mean that they are separated from the church. They are still welcome to join the church, but they cannot receive communion if divorced and remarried because they are living in this state of contradiction. They cannot receive communion until they resolve the situation of contradiction, knowing that they are truly married to their original spouse if that first marriage was canonically valid. Divorce is immoral because it introduces disorder in the family and into society, bringing great harm to the deserted spouse and to the children. As always, when we teach Catholic morality, we don't teach it to condemn people, but more for the sake of prevention. It is essential to teach our young people today who long to fall in love and get married and start a family, for them to understand that this is what marriage involves. It is very important to choose wisely, because once you enter into a marriage, in God's eyes, this is for life. Other sins against the dignity of marriage that we have already seen in our study of the Decalogue. Polygamy is contrary to the undivided and exclusive conjugal love that marriage requires. Obviously, incest and sexual abuses on children and adolescents. And this is not going to be popular among many young people today, but free unions, including living together unmarried, trial marriages, are a serious sin against the dignity of marriage. Love seeks to be definitive. It cannot be an arrangement until further notice. So living together before getting married is a serious sin. It is a call to conversion, to repentance, to go to confession, and to rectify that situation. What can union mean when the partners make no commitment to one another, each exhibiting a lack of trust in the other, in himself, or in the future, by always keeping this exit hatch open, basically? If it's not working out, I can always leave. This is completely contrary to what the sexual union and what living together conveys to one another and to society. These situations offend against the dignity of marriage. They destroy the very idea of the family, and they weaken the sense of fidelity. Moreover, as I've mentioned in previous lessons, couples who cohabitate before getting married have a much higher chance of divorcing if they do ever get married, because what they're essentially doing is practicing lack of commitment. They're practicing living as if they're married, but without this true commitment to one another, without saying, hey, I'm going to stick with you no matter what because I love you and I'm committed to you. There's always this escape door in case something doesn't work out. And so young people, don't do it. Wait until you get married to live together. The other essential aspect of marriage, as we've mentioned before, is openness to fertility. This goes back to Genesis chapter 1. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Human life is a splendid gift of God's goodness. And so is love. Love is a gift. It does not end in the couple because it makes them capable of cooperating with God by giving life to a new person. Truly, the act of procreation, as its name implies, is a type of co-creating together with God the Creator. It is participating in God's own work of creation. So called to transmit life and educate their children, spouses share in the creative power and even in the fatherhood of God. Marriage and conjugal love are ordained to the procreation and education of children, which are the crowning glory of marriage. Let's talk a little more about the fecundity of marriage as an essential element to the nature of marriage. Fecundity, or fruitfulness, is a gift and the natural end of marriage, for conjugal love naturally tends to be fruitful. A child springs from the very heart of the mutual love of the spouses, as is fruit and fulfillment. Children are a living reflection of their parents' love, a permanent sign of conjugal unity, and a living and permanent synthesis of their father and mother. So parental love is called to be for the children a sign of God's love. As parents love their children, they teach them in the way of life of living as children of the church, learning to love God and one another. This is why the love between husband and wife must always be open to new life. That is, every sexual act must remain open to new life, as we talked about last time, and we will come back to that in our next lesson on the Christian family. In summary, marriage is the intimate, exclusive, indissoluble communion of life and love, entered by man and woman at the design of the Creator, for the purpose of their own good and the procreation and education of children. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. As we said last time, the marital covenant calls spouses to share in the free, total, faithful, and fruitful love of God. And authentic married love is caught up into divine love and is directed and enriched by the redemptive power of Christ and the salvific action of the church. Married love is caught up, it's lifted into divine love and enriched by Christ's redemptive work, it is strengthened and given new powers for the sake of not just the love between the spouses and within their family, but the whole salvific action of the church. As we come towards the conclusion of this lesson, let's look at a beautiful text from Pope Benedict XVI, where he discusses the distinction and the interaction between two types of love, Eros and agape. So according to Pope Benedict, and this is deeply rooted in Christian and even pre-Christian tradition, there are several types of love, and the two that we're going to focus on here are Eros and agape. What is Eros? As is clear from the word, this is the root for the word in English, erotic. And so Eros is an ascending, a possessive, and often a sexual love that seeks to receive from another. So Eros tends to be ascending. It longs to receive something from the other that could make me more fulfilled, more happy. It seeks to receive from the other, and Eros, for that reason, is often associated with sexual love, something that brings tremendous pleasure and joy. In distinction to Eros, we have agape, and this would be a descending, unconditional, self-sacrificing love, in which one gives of oneself to another. It seeks above all the good of the beloved. And both are essential to marriage, right? When you meet someone that you may be attracted to, obviously Eros is the first one that kicks in, right? You find this person attractive, this person brings you joy, brings you some kind of delight, and you want to spend more time with this person. And so love in its beginnings tends to be selfish because it brings you something, right? But as love transforms itself, it is called to morph into agape without completely abandoning Eros, but this love needs to turn into something that is more self-giving rather than self-seeking. Both loves are good, yet Eros is called to be taken up by agape. It seeks to become definitive, exclusive, and forever. So let's look at this beautiful text from Benedict XVI from his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, that is, God is love. This is what he writes. Eros and agape, ascending love and descending love, can never be completely separated. The more the two in their different aspects find a proper unity in the one reality of love, the more the true nature of love in general is realized. Even if Eros is at first mainly covetous and ascending, a fascination for the great promise of happiness, in drawing near to the other, it is less and less concerned with itself, increasingly seeks the happiness of the other. It is concerned more and more with the beloved, bestows itself and wants to be there for the other. The element of agape thus enters into this love, for otherwise, Eros is impoverished and even loses its own nature. On the other hand, man cannot live by oblative, sacrificial, descending love alone. He cannot always give, he must also receive. Anyone who wishes to give love must also receive love as a gift. Certainly, as the Lord tells us, one can become a source from which rivers of living water flow. Yet, to become such a source, one must constantly drink anew from the original source, which is Jesus Christ, from whose pierced heart flows the love of God. What an amazing text. So what is Benedict saying here? We have Eros and agape, this ascending love and descending love. Very often love begins as Eros between two people who like each other, right? And so this is normal, it's covetous, it's ascending, it searches for this joy and this happiness that one is lacking. But if love only remains at the level of Eros, eventually it becomes impoverished. This Eros needs to be transformed into a self-giving love of agape. But how do we give and give? Sometimes our spouse may have different needs and marriage requires a lot of us. So how do we keep giving to our spouse? Well, we cannot create love out of thin air. We must receive it from the greater and higher love than all. And this is the love of Christ. And so for Eros and agape to survive and thrive and grow, we must constantly drink from the fountain of Christ's love. What a beautiful text. In conclusion and preparing for our next lesson on the Christian family, Christian marriage leads to the family as a communion of persons. In matrimony and in the family, Each human person is introduced into the human family and into the family of God that is the church. All members of the family should exercise the priesthood of the baptized by receiving the sacraments, by offering prayer and thanksgiving, by the witness of a holy life, by self-denial and active charity. They also exercise the priesthood of the baptized by learning endurance and the joy of work, exercising fraternal love, generous forgiveness, and the offering of one's life. We're going to unpack all of this in our next lesson. In conclusion for today, let us mention once again the domestic church that we mentioned in our last lesson on human love in divine revelation. And we already quoted this saying from Pope John Paul II. The history of mankind, the history of salvation, passes by way of the family. God himself entered human history through the family. Christ fully discloses man to himself, beginning with the family in which he chose to be born and to grow up in, the Holy Family of Nazareth, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus himself. This is why the church is the family of God. By learning about the family, we also learn about what the church is and what the church is supposed to be. In an unbelieving world, Christian families are to be islands of living, radiant faith. And in the family, parents are by word and example the first heralds of the faith to their children. The home is the first school of Christian life. Christian marriage is far more than a private commitment or a romantic ideal. It is a sacrament, a place where Christ himself is present, strengthening spouses to love as he loves. But marriage doesn't exist in isolation. It gives rise to something even greater, the Christian family. In our next episode, we'll explore the family as the domestic church, its dignity, its mission, and its vital role in the life of the church and the world. I will see you then. Shalom, and until next time.